And for more, I'm joined by the head of the United Nations Development Programme in New York, Achim Steiner. Achim Steiner, good to have you with us. Now, emerging economies, developing countries, they are very much exposed to this crisis, this virus crisis. Which region worries you the most in terms of the pandemic and the following economic decline?
Well, as of this morning, we know that 212 countries and territories are affected by COVID-19. So the concern of all of us, but also of the United Nations, is for all countries. But indeed, as you point out, in many parts of the world, Africa perhaps being one key region of the world, but also parts of Asia, Latin America, Central America, are areas where the virus is beginning to impact, both in terms of a crisis in the health system, but then also with the social and economic impacts. And the issue of greatest concern for all of us must be that many of these poorer countries and economies don't have the health system infrastructure to cope, first of all, with the suppression of the virus. Secondly, with also providing the kind of social safety nets that are needed in order to deal with this extraordinary impact. Our sister organization, International Labour Organization, yesterday published new numbers in terms of expected job losses. 195 million jobs lost, potentially. This is a number that is without precedent, and that is a shock to not only our economies, but our societies, to livelihoods, especially when you bear in mind that over 60% of people employed in the world are employed in the informal sector. No work means no livelihood, means no social safety net. These are the front lines of the battle in dealing with this pandemic, which is both a health crisis, it is becoming a social and economic and a developmental crisis, and it is one that requires us to work together in ways as we have never been challenged to do so before.
And I mean, the sinister scenario that you're describing here also tells us that this virus, of course, causes havoc everywhere. And even rich nations are struggling to deal with the economic fallout from the pandemic. How then can poorer countries hope to cope with it?
Well, I think the first priority must be what the WHO has told us all, which is to suppress the virus. This is the first line of defense, and much of the work of the United Nations, of the international community right now, must be focused on helping countries to, first of all, be able to stabilize their health systems and to have that health systems response in place. Secondly, and these are the programs that are urgently needed, is to provide fiscal means. Governments need money right now, first of all, to respond to the health crisis, but secondly, also to an unfolding social and human and economic and development crisis. And this means having resources available with which to finance mitigation measures, cash transfer programs, being able to stabilize local parts of the economy. And as you also said, countries very often are now confronted with even the consequences of the virus somewhere else in the world. Take small island developing states. Many of them rely on tourism. Tourism has imploded. Very often that's 30, 40, 50% of the GDP of these nations. This is economic collapse.
Right. I mean, what you're describing here is really that we have to give a helping hand to each other, even though we're affected by this pandemic ourselves. And this at a time when multilateralism is weakened and people have become more egoistic. There's more nationalism around. Do you think that this has weakened our ability to give a global response to this crisis?
Well, perhaps in the first reflex, there is a tendency to look after oneself, and this is understandable, it is natural, and I think every country is confronted with unprecedented challenges right now. But this virus has taught us one thing, and that is that it is a global pandemic. We can only succeed in controlling and ultimately overcoming this pandemic by working together. There is no go-it-alone solution. And therefore, the ability of richer nations to also step up right now, first of all, through the kinds of measures that have been proposed through the International Monetary Fund, but also looking at issues of debt relief and debt cancellation in order to allow countries that are in need of help not to have to use the funds that they receive from the international community to pay off debtors. Right now, there is a need for massive investment in developing countries. It will rely on the richer part of the world, but it is also in our common interest, because even from a perspective of economic recovery, the markets into which industrialized nations will sell after this pandemic are the markets of also the developing world. So there is a common interest, an enlightened self-interest, as much as the need for solidarity right now in order to massively ramp up this support, because otherwise we will not only see the economic collapse, there are social, geopolitical consequences that I think none of us have either considered so far clearly enough and that need urgent attention.
All right. Help others to help ourselves, basically. Achim Steiner, the head of the United Nations Development Programme in New York. Thank you so much for your time.